In the drawer of an old vanity, a small wooden music box rests with its lid closed. Its surface is scratched with the gentle geography of decades, its brass key tarnished with age to the color of dried honey. No one has wound it in decades, yet on certain nights, when moonlight filters through the window at just the right angle, a melody emerges not from turning gears, but from memory itself. A lullaby hummed to a child who is now grown, a waltz danced in a kitchen long since remodeled, a simple tune whistled while washing dishes on an ordinary Tuesday that would later be remembered as perfect. The vanity itself stands in a corner of the bedroom where morning light catches dust motes dancing in slow spirals, its mirror clouded at the edges with a silvering of time, yet still reflecting enough to hold the room's quiet essence. Drawers slide open with a soft resistance born of decades of salt-laden air and careful hands, their interiors lined with faded velvet worn smooth in the exact shape of objects once cherished and now gone. The air carries the dry perfume of aged timber and dried. Lavender tucked into drawer corners decades ago, mingling with the faint mineral scent of brass polish crystallized in wood grain. The music box rests in perfect repose, its wooden casing darkened by years to the color of weak tea, the grain rising in gentle waves like sand patterns left by a receding tide. Its lid is inlaid with mother of pearl in a pattern resembling scattered stars, each fragment catching the light not as sharp reflection but as soft luminescence that seems to originate from within the wood itself. When untouched, it holds its silence not as emptiness, but as potential, a vessel waiting to be filled with. The right quality of attention, the precise angle of moonlight, the particular weight of a heart ready to receive. The melody arrives without warning as moonlight finds its precise threshold. A single tune neither complex nor simple, but existing in the space between memory and presence, a sound felt rather than heard. It does not fade gradually, but vanishes completely the moment light shifts past its precise angle, leaving behind not silence, but a resonance that lingers in the bones like the memory of touch. No wind stirs the room air, no hand touches the key, yet the melody appears with the inevitability of tide meeting shore, a phenomenon not of mechanics, but of memory. The music box belonged to a woman who collected sounds the way others collect stamps or coins. Her name was Eleanor, though most who knew her called her Ellie, a name that carried the particular warmth of someone who understood that the smallest moments often hold the greatest meaning. She moved through her home with the unhurried grace of water finding its level, her hands, mapped with fine blue veins and knuckles softened by years, performing rituals that required no conscious thought. She'd arrive each morning before dawn when mist still clung to the garden beyond her window, unlocking the vanity drawer with fingers that knew its resistance by heart, while other collectors in the valley prized perfection and preservation. Eleanor cultivated presence, the particular quality of attention that allows a moment to be fully inhabited without the need to capture or control it. Her collection was not of objects, but of experiences. The slight imperfections in a child's off-key singing, the breath between notes in a husband's evening whistling, the way a melody changed slightly each time it was played. She preferred the fleeting nature of live music, not because it was better than recordings, but because it was more honest. Recordings felt too permanent, too fixed, like photographs that captured a face but not its living essence. Live music carried the breath of its creator, the slight tremble of emotion in a voice, the particular quality of light in the room where it was played. These imperfections were not flaws to be corrected, but signatures to be cherished. She'd win the box after particularly beautiful moments and let it play, believing the mechanism absorbed something of the feeling into its tiny metal teeth. A Tuesday evening when her daughter had practiced piano for the first time without being asked, the notes stumbling but sincere, would be captured in the box's winding. A Saturday morning when her husband had whistled while making pancakes, his tune meandering but joyful, would be preserved in its mechanism. A quiet moment when she'd hum to herself while folding laundry, the melody rising and falling with her breath, would be held in its brass cylinder. The music box never judged the quality of music brought to it, only received it. A child's clumsy rendition of Twinkle, Twinkle received the same gentle absorption as a professional's flawless sonata. The box understood that music's value lies not in technical perfection, but in emotional authenticity, in the truth carried between notes, in the love woven through melody. When she passed, her daughter packed the box away, unable to bear the sound of its familiar tune. The change occurred not with fanfare, but with the quiet certainty of seasons turning. Eleanor's final evening saw her winding the box one last time as moonlight filtered through the window, her thin frame silhouetted against fractured light, her hands moving with the certainty of decades of ritual. Her daughter, now a woman with children of her own, found the box in the vanity drawer days later and could not bring herself to wind it. The silence that followed felt not like peace but like absence, a hollow space where music had once lived. She wrapped the box in tissue paper and tucked it into the back of the drawer, her tears falling silently onto the wooden lid as if adding one final layer to its collection of memories. Years passed. The house changed hands, the vanity gathered dust, but the music box never fell completely silent. It did not grow lonely in its solitude. It simply waited, its brass mechanism holding the memory of every melody ever drawn from its core, its wooden casing preserving the warmth of every hand that had ever wound its key. A man moved into the house last autumn after his wife's death. His name was Thomas, though he'd begun to feel like a collection of absences rather than a person, a series of silences where conversations once lived, empty spaces on the couch where her body used to rest, quiet mornings where her humming once filled the kitchen. He'd been a musician once, before life's practicalities demanded other pursuits. A pianist who'd played in small clubs and taught lessons to neighborhood children his fingers moving across keys with a certainty that had felt like breathing. The music had not left him gradually but completely. The moment he realized he could no longer find the joy in scales he'd practiced for 40 years, the day he'd closed the piano lid and walked away without looking back. He'd stopped playing not from lack of skill, but from lack of heart, the notes feeling hollow without her in the audience, the melodies meaningless without her humming along from the kitchen. He came to the house seeking not a fresh start, but simply a different kind of silence, one that didn't echo with the ghost of what had been. He found the box while unpacking, its presence unexpected in the vanity drawer he'd assumed held only dust and forgotten hairpins. He opened it out of curiosity, his fingers tracing the mother-of-pearl inlay with a gentleness that surprised him, and felt something shift in his chest, not grief, but recognition. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was waiting. He didn't wind it. He simply closed the lid and left it on the nightstand. The box seemed to understand his hesitation, its wooden surface cool beneath his palm, yet carrying a warmth that suggested it had been waiting for this particular moment, this particular hand. He turned away to continue unpacking, but found himself glancing back at the box throughout the evening as if checking on a sleeping child. That night, as he lay awake staring at the ceiling, the melody began, not loud, not demanding attention, but soft as breath. Moonlight filtered through the window at precisely the right angle, striking the box's lid and seeming to pass directly through the wood into the mechanism within. He didn't recognize the tune, but he felt its shape, the rise and fall of contentment, the gentle arc of being loved without condition, the quiet certainty that some moments are meant to be carried forward even when the people who created them are gone. The melody carried no specific memory of his wife, no song they'd danced to, no lullaby she'd hummed, no tune she'd whistled while cooking, but it carried the essence of her presence, the particular quality of light in their kitchen on Sunday mornings, the weight of her hand on his shoulder after a difficult day, the sound of her laughter rising through the house like music itself. The notes were not complex but profound, each one carrying the weight of ordinary moments that had become extraordinary through love. He cried then, not from sadness, but from the unexpected kindness of being offered a melody when he'd forgotten how to make his own. The tears were not dramatic but quiet, the kind that comes from deep reservoirs long dammed, the slow leak of music held back through practical years, the gentle release of creativity sacrificed for security, the soft unwinding of a heart that had learned to beat without its rhythm section. The music faded after a minute. The house returned to silence, but something had changed. The silence was no longer empty, but full of possibility, full of memory, full of the quiet understanding that music had not left him but had been waiting for him to remember how to listen differently. The next morning, he sat at the piano he hadn't touched in years and played a single chord, then another. His fingers, stiff from disuse, found their way across the keys with a certainty that surprised him. Not the technical precision of his youth, but the emotional authenticity of his experience. The music that emerged wasn't the same as what he'd heard from the box. It was his own, but it carried the same quality of tenderness, the same understanding that some melodies exist not to be perfect, but to be true. He played for 20 minutes that morning, not composing but communing. The notes were simple, the progression basic, yet they carried a depth that technical proficiency alone could never achieve. He felt his wife's presence not as ghost, but as inspiration, not demanding he play her favorite songs, but encouraging him to find his own voice again, to create music that carried their shared history without being bound by it. He never heard the music box play again. He didn't need to. The box's gift was not a permanent soundtrack, but a moment of perfect resonance. A single night when memory became melody and melody became permission. The box had not restored his music, but had reminded him that it had never truly left, only been waiting for the right conditions to bloom again. The music box continues its quiet work in the vanity drawer, its melody emerging on certain nights for those who might one day open the lid with open hands and open hearts. It does not discriminate by age or circumstance, only by the quality of silence brought to its presence. A teenager mourning the end of childhood finds its tune humming with the memory of bedtime stories. An old man visiting the house where he grew up feels its melody carrying the echo of his mother's singing. The melody asks nothing in return, no prayers, no promises, no transformation. It simply offers what music has always offered. Not escape from reality, but connection to it. The quiet certainty that some experiences transcend their moment of creation to become part of who we are. that some melodies live not in air but in memory, not in hearing but in being. And that reminder, once received, becomes the first note of everything that follows, not because it shows us how to play again, but because it reminds us that we never truly stopped, not because it promises perfection, but because it honors authenticity, a truth that needs no audience because it arrives already whole, already home, already singing in the quiet chambers where we have always carried what we thought we'd lost. A melody that requires no instrument beyond the heart itself, no score. Beyond the lived experience of love, no performance beyond the courage to begin again. In a stone cottage at the edge of the moors, a wooden spinning wheel stands motionless in the corner. Its distaff is empty, its bobbin bare. Dust motes dance in the slanted light that falls through the window, but the wheel itself never gathers dust. Its surface remains smooth and warm to the touch, as if someone has just risen from the stool before it. The cottage itself rests where the moorland meets the sky, its stone walls weathered by generations of wind and rain to the color of dried heather, its roof thatched with reeds that whisper secrets when the breeze rises. The door hangs slightly ajar on rusted hinges, not from neglect but from the slow settling of timber over decades, creating a gap just wide enough for light and memory to pass through. Inside, the air carries the dry perfume of aged timber and dried herbs tucked into wall. Cracks decades ago, mingling with the faint mineral scent of peat smoke crystallized in the hearthstones. The spinning wheel occupies the room's corner not as decoration but as anchor, its wooden frame darkened by years to the color of strong tea, the grain rising in gentle waves like sand patterns left by a receding tide. Its surface holds the ghost imprint of countless hands that have rested there, palms pressed against the wheel's rim, fingers curled around the distaff, thumbs guiding thread with practiced certainty. When untouched, it rests in perfect repose, yet carries a vibration so subtle it can only be felt by those who know how to listen with their hands rather than their ears. The wheel's warmth is not thermal but empathic, a living temperature that speaks of continuity rather than combustion. It does not judge the quality of silence brought to it, only receives it. A grieving widow's quiet presence receives the same gentle holding as a child's curious exploration. The wood fibers drink in not just weight, but witness, the particular pressure of a body leaning forward to speak, the vibration of whispered words traveling up through palms into the grain below, the warmth of tears that fall not from eyes, but from some deeper source and soak silently into the wood. The cottage belonged to a woman who spun not wool or flax, but stories. Her name was Morwenna, though most who knew her simply called her the spinner, a title spoken with a quiet reverence reserved for those who understand that some truths can only be told through rhythm and repetition. She moved through her cottage with the unhurried grace of water finding its level, her hands, mapped with fine blue veins and knuckles softened by years, performing rituals that required no conscious thought. She'd arrive each evening after supper when the fire had burned down to embers, unlocking the cottage door with a key worn smooth by generations of palms, while other spinners in the valley prized efficiency and uniform thread. Morwenna cultivated presence, the particular quality of attention that allows memory to find its own rhythm without interference. The gentle certainty that some stories cannot be hurried without losing their essence. Her spinning was not always of fiber. Sometimes it was. Of silence. Sometimes of shared space. Sometimes of the simple act of witnessing another's truth without rushing to fix it. She'd sit at the wheel each evening after supper, her hands moving rhythmically while she spoke aloud. Not to anyone in particular, but to the space around her. She'd tell of her childhood by the sea, of her husband's laughter on their wedding day, of the small kindnesses that had sustained her through difficult years. Her voice carried not the sharp edges of performance, but the soft contours of remembrance. The particular cadence of someone speaking to an old friend, the gentle rise and fall of emotion that comes from truth rather than artifice. And as she spoke, the wheel would turn slowly, spinning her words into something tangible, a silver thread that coiled around the bobbin, humming softly with the resonance of what had been shared. The thread was not visible to ordinary eyes, but could be felt as a vibration in the air, a shimmer at the edge of perception that suggested something more than memory was being created in that corner. It carried the particular weight of a head resting briefly against a shoulder during a moment of overwhelm, the vibration of whispered thanks traveling up through the wheel's frame into the distaff, the warmth of hands clasped tightly around the bobbin during a sudden realization. The wheel never judged the quality of story brought to it, only received it. A child's clumsy retelling of a school day received the same gentle absorption as an elder's carefully crafted life narrative. The wheel understood that story's value lies not in technical perfection but in emotional authenticity, in the truth carried between words, in the love woven through memory. When she passed, the wheel didn't still. It simply waited. The change occurred not with fanfare, but with the quiet certainty of seasons turning. Morwenna's final evening saw her spinning a particularly long thread as she spoke of watching the sunrise over the moors one last time, her thin frame silhouetted against the window's fading light, her hands moving with the certainty of decades of ritual. The cottage stood empty for weeks after they carried her away, its windows reflecting only sky and passing clouds, its rooms holding the faint imprint of a life fully lived. Dust settled on surfaces with a patience that suggested permanence. Then, on the first full moon after her passing, as twilight softened the edges of the world, the wheel began its slow turning, not tentatively, but with the same sure rhythm it had known for decades, as if the space between spinner and story had never been broken. A writer came to the cottage last winter seeking solitude. Her name was Alara. Though she'd begun to feel like a collection of deadlines rather than a person, a series of word counts to be met, chapters to be completed, expectations to be fulfilled. She'd been commissioned to write a memoir about her grandmother, but every time she sat at her laptop, the words felt flat and lifeless. She knew the facts of her grandmother's life, the dates, the places, the major events, but she couldn't capture the essence of who she'd been, the woman behind the photographs, the voice behind the letters. Her days had become a cycle of frustration and self-recrimination, rising before dawn to write, staring at the blinking cursor until her eyes ached, deleting more sentences than she kept, retreating to bed with the hollow certainty that she was failing not just her publisher but her grandmother's memory. She'd tried the expected remedies, writing retreats where she stared at mountain vistas until her eyes ached, therapy sessions where she traced patterns in the carpet while speaking of creative block, Long walks through city parks where every couple holding hands felt like an accusation of her own solitude. Nothing reached the hollow space that had taken root beneath her ribs. That winter had brought a particular sharpness to the silence. The early darkness pressing against windows, the muffled silence of snow-covered moors, the hollow echo of her own footsteps in rooms that held no other presence. She'd taken the cottage not for its charm but for its isolation, signing the lease without visiting a second time, desperate for any change of scenery that might trick her mind into producing words again. Frustrated, she rose from her desk and wandered into the corner where the spinning wheel stood. The laptop screen glowed with a single sentence she'd written and deleted 7 times, each attempt feeling more hollow than the last. She ran a hand over its smooth wood, feeling the faint warmth beneath her palm. Not the dry heat of sun-warmed timber, but the gentle warmth of skin that has absorbed afternoon light. A living temperature that spoke of continuity rather than abandonment. Without thinking, she sat on the stool and began to speak. The words came not from her head but from some deeper place. The particular quality of light in her grandmother's kitchen on Sunday mornings, the weight of her hand on a shoulder after a difficult day, the sound of her laughter rising through the house like music itself. She loved roses, the writer began. Not cut flowers in a vase, but wild ones that grew along the fence. She'd prune them every spring, humming while she worked. I never knew the tune. The wheel trembled beneath her fingers. Not a violent shudder, but a gentle vibration, like a leaf stirred by breath rather than wind. A single silver thread emerged from nothingness, coiling slowly around the bobbin. The thread was not visible to ordinary eyes, but could be felt as a vibration in the air, a shimmer at the edge of perception that suggested something more than memory was being created in that corner. It carried the particular weight of a head resting briefly against a shoulder. During a moment of overwhelm, the vibration of whispered thanks traveling up through the wheel's frame into the distaff, the warmth of hands clasped tightly around the bobbin during a sudden realization. The writer continued, speaking of small things she'd forgotten. The way her grandmother's hands smelled of yeast and lavender after baking, the sound of her slippers shuffling across the kitchen floor before dawn, the particular cadence of her voice when she was trying not to cry. With each memory, the thread grew longer, glowing faintly in the dim room. The wheel turned not with the frantic energy of obligation, but with the slow deliberation of remembrance, each revolution marking not time, past but truth uncovered. She didn't speak of grand events or dramatic moments. She spoke of ordinary Tuesdays and quiet evenings, of small kindnesses and gentle routines, of the particular way her grandmother would tilt her head when listening intently, of the sound of her breathing as she fell asleep in her armchair after a long day. These memories surfaced not as sharp pains, but as gentle impressions. The particular warmth of morning light on her grandmother's bedroom wall, the weight of her hand resting on a shoulder. During a difficult conversation, the quiet joy that had lived in her bones before illness came. When she finally fell silent, the bobbin was wrapped in silver. She didn't touch it. She simply sat there, breathing. The wheel held its final position not as conclusion but as invitation. The silver thread coiled around the bobbin not as evidence of what had been said but as promise of what might still be spoken. The silence that followed was not empty but full of possibility, full of memory, full of the quiet understanding that stories had not left her but had been waiting for her to. Remember how to listen differently. Something had shifted, not in the room, but in her. The memories were no longer fragments to be assembled into a narrative. They were living threads, still connected to the woman who had woven them into being. She felt her grandmother's presence not as ghost, but as inspiration, not demanding she write a perfect memoir, but encouraging her to find her own voice again, to create words that carried their shared history without being bound by it. She returned to her desk that evening and began to write. The words came differently this time, not as facts to be reported, but as truths to be honored. She wrote until dawn, her fingers moving across the keys with the same rhythm she'd felt at the spinning wheel. The sentences were not complex but profound, each one carrying the weight of ordinary moments that had become extraordinary through love. She felt the wheel's presence not as distraction but as companion, a silent witness to the truth. That some stories exist not to be perfect but to be true. The cottage stands empty again now. The spinning wheel waits in its corner. The silver thread remains coiled around the bobbin, not as evidence of what was said, but as invitation for what might still be spoken. It does not discriminate by age or circumstance, only by the quality of silence brought to its presence. A teenager mourning the end of childhood finds its thread humming with the memory of bedtime stories. An old man visiting the cottage where he grew up feels its vibration carrying the echo of his mother's singing. The thread asks nothing in return, no prayers, no promises, no transformation. It simply offers what storytelling has always offered. Not escape from reality, but connection to it. The quiet certainty that some experiences transcend their moment of creation to become part of who we are. That some memories live not in facts, but in feeling, not in dates, but in details. And in that presence, we find the words we didn't know we were carrying, not because the wheel gives them to us, but because it reminds us that they have always been there, waiting in the space between heartbeats for the courage to speak them aloud, not because it promises perfection, but because it honors authenticity, a truth that needs no audience because it arrives already whole, already home. Already spinning in the quiet chambers where we have always carried what we thought we'd lost. A thread that requires no loom beyond the heart itself, no pattern beyond the lived experience of love, no completion beyond the courage to begin again, knowing that some stories are not meant to be finished but to be felt, not to be told but to be true. On a shelf in an abandoned conservatory, a wrought iron birdcage stands open. Its door swings freely on rusted hinges, creaking a soft melody that marks time more gently than any clock. No bird has lived inside it for 50 years, yet the air within the cage shimmers faintly, as if something continues to move there, not trapped, but choosing to remain. The conservatory itself rests against the north face of a stone manor whose windows have long since surrendered to ivy, its glass panes cracked and clouded with the silvering of decades, yet still catching the western sun with impossible precision. Morning light filters through the fractured glass in fractured coins that shift with the hour, dappling the cracked tile floor in patterns that mark time more gently than any calendar. The air carries the dry perfume of aged timber and dried lavender, tucked into wall crevices decades ago, mingling with the faint mineral scent of damp earth and the ghost of roses that once bloomed in profusion along the eastern wall. Shadows pool in the corners where glass meets stone, not as absences of light, but as reservoirs of quiet, holding the echo of wings that once beat against freedom's threshold. The cage occupies a high shelf near the ceiling, its wrought iron bars twisted into delicate spirals resembling vines that never bore fruit, its surface darkened by years to the color of old honey, yet holding a soft inner luminescence when light strikes it just so. When untouched, it rests in perfect repose, its open door, swinging gently in rhythms that match neither breeze nor breath, but something older, the slow expansion and contraction of remembrance itself. The shimmering within the cage arrives without warning as sunlight finds its precise angle, a gentle motion that seems to originate not from physics but from the space between heartbeats. It does not fade gradually, but shifts with the light, becoming more or less visible depending on the hour, yet always present to those who know how to look with more than their eyes. No wind stirs the conservatory air. The single remaining window pane remains latched tight against the elements, yet the shimmering continues its silent dance, a ballet of almost presences, merely moments, almost was. The conservatory belonged to a man who collected birds not to keep them, but to heal them. His name was Alistair, though most who knew him simply called him the keeper, a title spoken with a quiet reverence reserved for those who understand that some forms of love require release rather than possession. He moved through his conservatory with the unhurried grace of water finding its level, his hands, mapped with fine blue veins and knuckles softened by years, performing rituals that required no conscious thought. He'd arrive each morning before dawn when mist still clung to the Manor's stone walls, unlocking the heavy oak door with a key worn smooth by generations of palms, while other collectors in the valley prized rarity and preservation. Alistair cultivated freedom, the particular quality of attention that allows a wounded creature to find its own strength without interference. The gentle certainty that some beings cannot be hurried toward healing without causing harm. His remedies were not always herbs or splints. Sometimes they were silence, sometimes a hand resting lightly near the cage without touching, sometimes the simple act of witnessing another's recovery without demanding progress. Injured sparrows, orphan finches, fledglings that had fallen from nests, he'd bring them here, mend their broken wings, and release them when they were ready. He understood that healing required both shelter and the constant reminder of what lay beyond it. The cage was never locked. Its door remained open always. He'd place food and water inside, then step back and wait, his presence a steady anchor, without being a constraint. Freedom isn't the absence of shelter. He'd tell visitors who came seeking spectacle, it's the presence of choice. He understood the distinction mattered. Captivity removes options, while sanctuary offers them. The birds that came to him were not prisoners but patients, temporary residents learning to trust their own strength again before returning to the sky that was their true home. The cage never judged the quality of injury brought to it, only received it. A sparrow with a broken wing received the same gentle care as a fledgling too young to fly. The iron bars held each creature not as confinement, but as protection, a boundary that said you are safe here without saying you must stay here. Alistair would sit for hours watching the birds within, his eyes holding not pity but patience, his silence speaking the truth that healing has its own timeline that cannot be rushed, without consequence. When he passed, the conservatory fell into disrepair. Windows cracked, plants withered, but the cage never gathered dust. The change occurred not with fanfare, but with the quiet certainty of seasons turning. Alistair's final morning saw him releasing a young robin whose wing had healed perfectly, his thin frame silhouetted against the rising sun, his hands moving with the certainty of decades of ritual. The conservatory stood empty for weeks after they carried him away, its glass panes reflecting only sky and passing clouds, its rooms holding the faint imprint of a life fully lived. Dust settled on surfaces with a patience that suggested permanence. Then, on the first spring morning after his passing, as sunlight softened the edges of the world, the shimmering within the cage began, not tentatively, but with the same sure rhythm it had known for decades, as if the space between shelter and freedom had never been broken. A woman came here one afternoon after leaving a job that had slowly erased her. Her name was Clara, though she'd begun to feel like a collection of compromises rather than a person, a series of yes offered when she meant no, boundaries softened until they vanished completely, opinions swallowed until she could no longer distinguish her own thoughts from the expectations of others. She hadn't been mistreated. She'd simply disappeared into the role. Her opinions softened, her boundaries blurred, her voice quieted until she could no longer distinguish her own thoughts from the expectations of others. She'd worked as a marketing director for a firm that valued conformity over creativity. Her days spent shaping other people's visions while her own gathered dust in notebooks stacked beneath her desk. The erosion had not been dramatic but gradual, the slow wearing away of confidence with each meeting where she'd stayed silent rather than speak her truth. The gentle sanding down of edges until she fit neatly into spaces that had never been designed for her. She tried the expected remedies. Therapy sessions where she traced patterns in the carpet while speaking of burnout. Long walks through city parks where every couple holding hands felt like an accusation of her own solitude. Evenings spent scrolling through social media until the images lost meaning. Nothing reached the hollow space that had taken root beneath her ribs. That afternoon had brought a particular sharpness to the silence. The fluorescent lights of her office pressing against her eyes, the hollow echo of her own footsteps in corridors that held no other presence, the crushing weight of a performance review that praised her compliance while erasing her contribution. She'd walked away with no plan, no destination, only the certainty that staying would have cost her something. Essential, the self she'd worked decades to build, only to watch it dissolve in the acid of constant compromise. She found the conservatory by accident, drawn by the wild roses climbing its crumbling walls. Their scent had reached her first, a perfume so rich and untamed it seemed to pull her forward without conscious decision. She'd followed the fragrance through overgrown gardens where thistles and clover fought for dominance, her city shoes sinking into soil that had not known pavement in generations. The manor stood silent against the sky, its stone walls darkened by lichen and patterns resembling forgotten maps, its windows reflecting the afternoon sun with fractured brilliance. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and forgotten things. Dust motes drifted through slanted beams that cut across the cracked tile floor like liquid gold, each particle catching fire for a moment before dissolving back into the hush. The conservatory's glass panes, though cracked in places, still held enough integrity to create a greenhouse effect that warmed the space despite the season. Vines climbed the walls in patient spirals, their tendrils finding purchase in cracks, worn smooth by decades of rain. And there, on the shelf, the open cage. She approached slowly, her footsteps silent on the cracked tiles, her breath catching in her throat as if approaching something sacred. the shimmering within stilled as if acknowledging her presence, not freezing in fear but pausing in recognition, like a conversation interrupted by the arrival of someone who belongs. She didn't reach for it. She simply stood there, breathing the same air that had once held so many small, beating hearts on their way back to freedom. Her hands rested at her sides, palms open not in supplication but in reception. The cage's open door swung gently in a rhythm that matched her slowing breath, its creak a soft counterpoint to the silence that had lived in her chest for years. And in that stillness, she felt something release in her chest, not a dramatic breaking, but a gentle unfolding. The tightness that had lived between her ribs for 5 years began to loosen its grip, not vanishing but changing texture, becoming something she could hold without breaking beneath it. She realized the cage hadn't held the birds captive. It had held them until they were ready, and her job hadn't been a prison. It had been a place she'd outgrown. The distinction mattered. Captivity removes choice, while sanctuary offers it. Her job had not been evil or abusive. It had simply ceased to be the right container for who she was becoming. Like the birds that had rested within these iron bars, she had needed shelter for a season, but that season had passed. The open door had always been there, waiting for her to recognize it as invitation rather than threat. She turned to leave, the afternoon light warm on her shoulders. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The cage's gift was not a permanent sanctuary, but a moment of perfect recognition. A single afternoon when the boundary between shelter and freedom softened enough for her to see herself clearly again. Walking back through the overgrown gardens, she noticed details she'd missed on her way in. The intricate pattern of veins in a fallen leaf, the patient industry of bees moving between wild roses, the gentle slope of the land toward the distant hills. Her steps felt different. Not lighter exactly, but more grounded, as if she carried her solitude not as burden, but as companion. She didn't apply for another job that night or the next. She simply opened her notebook for the first time in months and wrote a single sentence, not about career paths or timelines, but about the quality of light in the conservatory at 3:17 p.m. The sentence was simple, honest, true, and that was enough to begin again. The conservatory continues its quiet work season after season, its cage shimmering on certain mornings for those who might one day find their way through the overgrown gardens. It does not discriminate by age or circumstance, only by the quality of stillness brought to its threshold. A teenager mourning the end of childhood finds the shimmering humming with the memory of bedtime stories. An old man visiting the manor where he grew up feels its vibration, carrying the echo of his father's singing. The shimmering asks nothing in return. No prayers, no promises, no transformation. It simply offers what thresholds have always offered, a space to be witnessed without judgment. A reminder that some containers exist not to confine, but to protect until protection is no longer needed. Some spaces aren't meant to confine us. They're meant to hold us temporarily, until we remember our own capacity for flight. The cage teaches us that freedom and shelter are not opposites but partners, that the most profound liberation often comes not from breaking chains but from recognizing when a door has been open all along, and that remembering doesn't arrive as a command. It arrives as an open door, and the quiet certainty that we may walk through it whenever we're ready, not because we've earned it, but because it has always been there, waiting for us to see it not as barrier, but as threshold. A truth that needs no key because it arrives already unlocked, already open. already offering the gentle certainty that some forms of love require not possession but release, not control but trust, not captivity but the courage to let go and watch what happens when wings remember they were made for sky. In the pocket of a forgotten coat, hanging in a closet, a silver pocket watch rests with its chain coiled neatly beside it. Its face is cracked in a delicate web resembling frost on a winter window, its hands frozen at 3:17. No one has wound it in generations, yet when held against the chest, its glass warms and the second hand begins to move, not marking minutes, but synchronizing with the heartbeat of whoever holds it. The closet itself stands in the back corner of a bedroom where morning light filters through lace curtains in fractured patterns, its wooden rod bowed gently under the weight of garments untouched for decades. Dust motes drift through slanted beams that cut across floorboards worn smooth by generations of footsteps, each particle catching fire for a moment before dissolving back into the hush. The air carries the dry perfume of aged wool and cedar, mingling with the faint mineral scent of silver polish crystallized in fabric fibers. The coat hangs slightly askew on its wooden hanger, its shoulders softened by years of gravity, its pockets holding the ghost imprint of objects once carried and now gone. The watch rests in the inner breast pocket, not the outer one meant for show, but the intimate space closest to where a heart would beat if someone wore the coat. Its silver casing has darkened to the color of old honey, the metal warmed not by sun but by the memory of countless hands that have held it with reverence. When untouched, it rests in perfect repose, its frozen hands marking not a moment of tragedy, but a threshold between one rhythm and another. The watch's warmth is not thermal but empathic, a living temperature that speaks of continuity rather than mechanism. It does not judge the quality of heartbeat brought to it, only receives it. A racing pulse of anxiety receives the same gentle synchronization as a steady rhythm of peace. The glass face drinks in not just pressure but presence, the particular vibration of a body learning to trust its own rhythm, the subtle shift from shallow to deep breathing, the quiet certainty that arrives when we stop counting time and start feeling it. The watch belonged to a doctor who made house calls in an era before telephones and ambulances. His name was Dr. Elias Grayson, though most who knew him simply called him Elias, a name that carried the particular warmth of someone who understood that healing begins not with diagnosis but with presence. He moved through his practice with the unhurried grace of water finding its level, his hands mapped with fine blue veins and knuckles softened by years, performing rituals that required no conscious thought. He'd arrive at bedsides in all weather, his coat damp with rain or snow, his boots tracking mud across kitchen floors without apology or explanation. He carried no black bag of instruments or bottles of mysterious elixirs. His primary tool was attention, the particular quality of listening that allows a body to reveal its truth without interference. The gentle certainty that some ailments cannot be hurried toward healing without causing harm. His remedies were not always medicines. Sometimes they were silence, sometimes a hand resting lightly on a shoulder, sometimes the simple act of witnessing another's pain without rushing to fix it. He'd arrive at bedsides in all weather, his coat damp with rain or snow, and before speaking a word, He placed the watch against his patient's chest. "Let me listen to your time," he'd say, and he would, not counting seconds, but feeling the rhythm beneath the ribs, the story told by each beat, fast with fear, slow with exhaustion, steady with resilience. He understood that a heartbeat carries more information than any stethoscope could reveal. The particular cadence of grief, the subtle tremor of hope, the quiet strength of someone choosing to continue despite everything. He believed time wasn't universal, it was intimate. Each heart carried its own. He'd explained to medical students who visited his practice that clocks measure the world's time, but hearts measure our time. The difference between how long something takes and how long it feels. A minute of pain stretches differently than a minute of joy. An hour of waiting contracts differently than an hour of presence. The watch, he claimed, could translate between these languages, converting the external measurement of minutes into the internal experience of moments. The watch never judged the quality of rhythm brought to it, only held space for its expression. A child's frantic pulse after a nightmare received the same gentle attention as an elder's slow beat in their final hours. The silver casing held each heartbeat not as data to be recorded, but as story to be honored. A truth carried between beats, a love woven through rhythm. When he passed, the watch was tucked into his best coat and hung in the closet of his empty house. The change occurred not with fanfare, but with the quiet certainty of seasons turning. Elias's final house call saw him sitting with an old woman in her final hours, the watch resting against her chest as her rhythm slowed to its natural conclusion. He'd placed it back in his pocket with a gentleness that suggested completion rather than loss, his own heartbeat steady despite the grief he carried. The house changed owners. The coat remained. The watch waited. Years passed. The building aged around the empty closet. New families moving into other rooms. Children growing up in adjacent bedrooms. Yet the coat remained untouched by decay. Dust settled on everything except the watch and its chain, which stayed pristine as if brushed daily by invisible hands. The frozen hands continued their quiet vigil, not as haunting but as honoring, a daily acknowledgement that some rhythms persist beyond. Physical departure, that some timepieces measure not minutes but meaning. A young woman found it last spring while helping her grandmother sort through belongings before a move. Her name was Maya, though she'd begun to feel like a collection of expectations rather than a person, a series of grades to be earned, rotations to be completed, standards to be met. She was a medical student, home for the weekend, feeling the weight of expectations pressing down on her. She'd chosen medicine because she wanted to help people, but the reality of long hours and endless exams had begun to obscure that original impulse. She felt disconnected from her patients, from her purpose, from herself. Her days had become a cycle of performance and pressure, rising before dawn to study, rushing between lectures and clinical rotations, spending evenings memorizing facts that felt increasingly disconnected from the human beings they were meant to serve. She tried the expected remedies, study groups where she compared notes until her eyes ached, therapy sessions where she traced patterns in the carpet while speaking of burnout, long walks through campus where every couple holding hands felt like an accusation of her own solitude. Nothing reached the hollow space that had taken root beneath her ribs. That weekend had brought a particular sharpness to the silence. The fluorescent lights of the hospital pressing against her eyes. The hollow echo of her own footsteps in corridors that held no other presence. the crushing weight of a professor's feedback that praised her technical skill while erasing her compassion. She'd come home seeking not escape, but simply a different kind of air, one that didn't smell of antiseptic and anxiety. She slipped the watch into her palm on a whim, feeling its cool weight against her skin. The coat had caught her eye not for its style, but for its stillness. A garment that had clearly not been worn in decades, yet held a presence that suggested it was waiting for something. Her fingers found the inner pocket almost without conscious decision, and there it was, the watch, its silver casing cool against her palm. Its chain coiled like a sleeping serpent beside it. Then she pressed it to her chest. The glass warmed instantly. The frozen hands trembled, and the second hand began to move, not at its own pace, but at hers. The sensation traveled up her arm not as shock, but as recognition. A reminder that her body still carried rhythms that had nothing to do with external validation, nothing to do with grades or expectations, or the relentless forward march of academic calendars. Tick, tick, tick. Each beat resonated through the metal, up her arm, into her bones. She closed her eyes and simply listened, not to the watch, but to herself, to the rhythm that had carried her through every challenge, every doubt, every moment of uncertainty. The rhythm that had nothing to do with grades or expectations or external validation. The rhythm that was hers alone. She heard not just her heartbeat, but the story it told. The particular cadence of someone who had stayed up late studying not out of obligation, but out of genuine curiosity. The subtle tremor of someone who still felt awe when witnessing the human body's resilience. The quiet strength of someone who had chosen medicine not for prestige but for purpose. The watch did not judge the quality of her rhythm, only held space for its expression, translating the external measurement of her stress into the internal experience of her strength. The second hand moved in perfect synchronization with her pulse, not racing ahead in anxiety, not lagging behind in exhaustion, simply matching the truth of her body in that moment. She felt her breathing gradually deepen from the shallow rhythm she'd maintained for weeks, her jaw unclenched without conscious effort. The tightness in her chest began to soften at the edges, not vanishing but changing texture, becoming something she could hold without breaking beneath it. When she opened her eyes, the watch had stilled again, but something in her had shifted. The frozen hands had returned to their position at 3:17, yet the watch felt different in her palm. Not cold and inert, but warm with the memory of connection. She didn't suddenly feel confident or certain. She simply felt present, reconnected to the pulse that had always guided her, even when she'd forgotten to listen. She returned to school the next day, carrying the watch in her own pocket. She didn't use it to check the time. She used it to check in with herself. During long study sessions, she'd slip it from her pocket and press it to her chest for a moment, feeling her rhythm steady beneath the pressure. Before difficult exams, she'd hold it in her palm and remember that her worth was not measured in grades but in presence. When she felt disconnected from her patients, she'd think of the watch and remember that healing begins not with diagnosis but with attention. The watch continues its silent waiting in closets and drawers across the years. It doesn't measure minutes. It measures presence. The simple, profound truth that each heartbeat is a moment of being alive, and that being alive in itself is enough. It asks nothing in return. No prayers, no promises, no transformation. It simply offers what presence has always offered, a space to be witnessed without judgment, a reminder that some rhythms exist not to be fixed, but to be felt. Sometimes we forget that truth. The watch doesn't remind us with words. It reminds us with rhythm, the oldest language we know, a language that requires no translation because it arrives already whole, already home, already beating in the quiet chambers where we have always carried what we thought we'd lost. A truth that needs no clock because it arrives already timed, already measured, already offering the gentle certainty that some forms of time exist, not to be counted, but to be lived, not to be rushed, but to be felt, not to be mastered, but to be honored as the most intimate rhythm we will ever know. In a wooden sewing box lined with faded velvet, a silver thimble rests among spools of thread. Its surface is dented from years of use, its rim worn smooth by countless hours of careful work. No one has worn it on their finger in decades, yet on certain evenings, when the light slants through the window just so, the thimble glows faintly, as if still holding the warmth of the hands that once guided needle through cloth. The sewing box itself sits on a high shelf in a closet that smells of cedar and old paper, its wooden lid scarred by generations of fingernails prying it open, the velvet lining faded from deep burgundy to the color of dried roses. Dust motes drift through slanted beams of afternoon light that cut across the room like liquid amber, each particle catching fire for a moment before dissolving back into the hush. The air carries the dry perfume of aged thread and dried lavender tucked into the box's corners decades ago, mingling with the faint mineral scent of silver polish crystallized in the wood grain. The thimble occupies a small indentation in the velvet, its silver casing darkened by years to the color of old honey, the metal warmed not by sun, but by the memory of countless hands that have held it with reverence. When untouched, it rests in perfect repose, yet carries a vibration so subtle it can only be felt by those who know how to listen with their fingertips rather than their eyes. The dents along its surface are not flaws but records, the particular pressure of a thumb-pushing needle. Through denim, the gentle curve worn by years of guiding thread through delicate lace, the tiny scratches left by pins handled with care. The thimble's warmth is not thermal but empathic, a living temperature that speaks of continuity rather than mechanism. It does not judge the quality of hands brought to it, only receives them. A trembling hand of grief receives the same gentle holding as a steady hand of creation. The silver surface drinks in not just pressure but presence, the particular vibration of a body learning to mend what is broken. The subtle shift from frustration to patience, the quiet certainty that arrives when we choose repair over replacement. The sewing box belonged to a woman who believed in mending rather than replacing. Her name was Eleanor, though most who knew her simply called her Nana, a title spoken with the quiet reverence reserved for those who understand that some truths are woven into the very fabric of everyday objects. She moved through her home with the unhurried grace of water finding its level, her hands mapped with fine blue veins and knuckles softened by years, performing rituals that required no conscious thought. She'd sit in her armchair each evening after dinner, the thimble on her middle finger, her hands moving with a rhythm that was both practical and prayerful. Torn shirts became patchwork landscapes, telling stories of resilience. Frayed hems were reinforced with stitches so fine they disappeared into the fabric's memory. Buttons missing for years were sewn back on with patience and care. Each push of the needle a silent promise that what was loved would not be discarded. Everything can be repaired, she'd say, not always to its original state, but to something that still holds value. She understood the distinction mattered. Perfection demands erasure of flaws, while mending honors the history of what has been. A patched elbow carried the memory of a child's fall and recovery. A reinforced seam held the story of a garment worn through celebrations and sorrows. Each repair was not an attempt to hide damage, but to integrate it into a new whole, stronger at the broken places, wiser for the wear. The thimble never judged the quality of tear brought to it, only received it. A child's ripped teddy bear received the same gentle attention as a husband's work shirt torn on barbed wire. The silver cap held each mending not as obligation but as offering, a truth carried between stitches, a love woven through thread. When she passed, her daughter inherited the box but rarely opened it. Life was too busy for mending. It was easier to buy new, to discard what was broken, to move forward without looking back. The box remained on the shelf, its contents untouched. The change occurred not with fanfare, but with the quiet certainty of seasons turning. Eleanor's final evening saw her mending a tear in her favorite apron, the thimble resting on her finger as she tied off the last stitch with a soft exhale that seemed to say both hello and goodbye. The sewing box stood empty of use for weeks after they carried her away, its lid reflecting only dust and passing shadows, its interior holding the faint imprint of a life fully lived. Dust settled on the shelf with a patience that suggested permanence. Then, on the first full moon after her passing, as twilight softened the edges of the world, the thimble began its faint glowing, not tentatively, but with the same sure rhythm it had known for decades, as if the space between mender and mend had never been broken. A man found it last autumn after his divorce. His name was Thomas, though he begun to feel like a collection of absences rather than a person, a series of empty spaces where shared routines once lived, silent rooms where conversations used to echo, quiet mornings where two coffee cups once sat side by side. He'd moved into a small apartment with little more than what he could carry, the walls bare except for a single photograph he couldn't bring himself to hang. He'd been an architect who designed buildings meant to last centuries, yet his own marriage had crumbled in less than a decade. He hadn't seen the fractures forming, the slow erosion of shared dreams, the gentle sanding down of edges until they no longer fit together. He'd tried the expected remedies, therapy sessions where he traced patterns in the carpet while speaking of loss. Long walks through city parks where every couple holding hands felt like an accusation of his own solitude. Evenings spent scrolling through photos until the images lost meaning. Nothing reached the hollow space that had taken root beneath his ribs. That autumn had brought a particular sharpness to the silence, the early darkness pressing against windows, the muffled silence of leaves falling in the courtyard below, the hollow echo of his own footsteps in rooms that held no other presence. He'd taken the apartment not for its charm but for its emptiness, signing the lease without visiting a second time, desperate for any change of scenery that might trick his mind into. Moving forward, one evening, sorting through a box of his ex-wife's things that she'd asked him to keep, he found the sewing box tucked beneath a stack of books. He opened it out of curiosity, his fingers brushing against the thimble. It was warm, not the dry heat of sun-warmed metal, but the gentle warmth of skin that has absorbed afternoon light, a living temperature that spoke of continuity rather than abandonment. He didn't know why he picked it up. He'd never sewn anything in his life, but he slipped it onto his finger and sat there in the quiet apartment, feeling the weight of the tiny metal cap against his skin. The thimble fit perfectly despite his larger hands, its dents molding to his knuckle with an intimacy that suggested it had been waiting for this particular moment, this particular hand. And in that wait, he felt something shift. Not a solution to his grief, not a path forward, but a simple, quiet truth. Some things are worth mending, not because they can be restored to what they were, but because the act of mending itself has meaning, the care it requires, the patience it demands, the love it represents. The thimble did not judge the quality of his sorrow, only held space for its expression, translating the external measurement of his loss into the internal experience of his resilience. He thought of the marriage, not with bitterness, but with the same tenderness his grandmother must have felt for a torn shirt. It hadn't been beyond repair, but neither had it been meant to last forever. And that was okay. The stitches they'd sewn together had held for a season, and though they'd come undone, the fabric of who they were had not been destroyed, only changed, like cloth worn soft by years of use and love. He removed the thimble and placed it back in the box, but he kept the box on his nightstand. The thimble's gift was not a permanent solution, but a moment of perfect perspective, a single evening when the boundary between broken and whole softened enough for him to see his own worth clearly again. Weeks later, he began a new practice. Each evening before bed, he'd open the box and hold the thimble in his palm for exactly 1 minute. Not to fix anything, not to process anything, simply to remember that some things are worth the care of mending, even if they cannot be restored to their original form. He didn't return to his ex-wife or seek reconciliation. He simply returned to himself with a new understanding that healing is not about erasing the past, but integrating it into a stronger whole. The sewing box continues its quiet work on the nightstand, its thimble glowing faintly on certain evenings for those who might one day open the lid with open hands and open hearts. It does not discriminate by age or circumstance, only by the quality of stillness brought to its presence. A teenager mourning the end of a friendship finds its warmth humming with the memory of reconciliation. An old man visiting the house where he grew up feels its vibration carrying the echo of his mother's singing. The thimble asks nothing in return. No prayers, no promises, no transformation. It simply offers what mending has always offered. Not escape from brokenness, but connection to it. The quiet certainty that some experiences transcend their moment of fracture to become part of who we are. That some repairs live not in perfection but in presence. Not in erasure, but in integration. Some objects don't offer answers. They offer perspective. The gentle reminder that brokenness doesn't equal worthlessness, and that sometimes the smallest repairs require the greatest courage. Not the courage to fix everything, but the courage to begin with one stitch, one breath, one moment of choosing care over discard, patience over haste, love over fear. In the quiet glow of the thimble, we discover that mending is not about returning to what was, but about creating something new from what remains. A patchwork of experience that holds both the tear and the repair, both the loss and the love, both the brokenness and the beauty of having been loved enough to leave a mark. A truth that needs no needle beyond the heart itself. No thread beyond the lived experience of choosing to mend rather than discard. No pattern beyond the courage to begin again. One stitch at a time, honoring the wisdom that some things are not meant to be perfect, but to be whole in their own beautifully imperfect way. The fire burns low, but it does not go out. No matter how dark the night, a light waits for you here.